Hi, everybody. Great to be with you. We have today our fourth and final summary session, which is going to be taking us right until the end of the book. I'm going to put the text on screen here in case you'd like to follow along. So this is our last session, again, in the sense of a summary session in the introduction to Heidegger's contributions to philosophy of the event. The goal is to discuss the grounding, the future ones, and the last God. So you know we have had the prospect, the resonating, the interplay, and the leap. And now we have the grounding, the future ones, and the last God. The last chapter in the book, as you'll see if you have a copy, is called Being, B-E-Y-N-G. It's largely a recapitulation of what's come before, and I'm not planning to cover it separately, except to discuss one or two passages that may be helpful in relation to this figure or notion of the last God. So in other words, make sure that when you review the book, you do read the final chapter on being. You might find there something that you have not encountered or heard before, even if it's largely recapitulation. And nevertheless, we'll be drawing on it a little bit as we go through this session. The basic idea of the grounding is, in a way, straightforward. It's that we've been uprooted from the ground of our existence, a theme that we've had throughout the text so far. Being has abandoned us, and all around us are the signs of the dominance of metaphysics. But Heidegger has already shown us that. He's begun to clear the space for a leap into the truth of being. Grounding means leaping and remaining steadfast in the space that is opened up thereby. If you think back to the very first few sessions that we did together, we discussed pulling apart the two columns, column A and column B, metaphysics and conceptual thinking. And we said that the leap is in a way the pulling apart, but the grounding is where we keep them apart, where we remain steadfast in the column B that's been opened up, where we hold that space, we ground that space. So let's go back to the notes here. Grounding means leaping and remaining steadfast in the space that is opened up thereby. Through this grounding, as Heidegger writes, the human being is transformed from the ground up, and the previously reigning definition of the human being as the rational animal collapses. The human being is transformed or displaced in the grounding into Dasein. So we could say here, before we go back to the notes, that Dasein is the name for the human being to the extent to which, after having leapt, he is grounding the truth of being. Now, we wouldn't want to call Dasein the human being in all circumstances or in all situations because, there's a relationship in the sense that the rational animal, Dasein underlies these other distorted interpretations of what it is to be a human being. Turning away from our Dasein or being alienated from our Dasein can be the basis for these other definitions or determinations of what it is to be a human being. But we're only authentically Dasein, we're only properly speaking Dasein when we are the space in which the truth of being finds its ground or grounds itself. We'll get into that more as we go through these notes. So continuing, you should take a look at some of the things that Heidegger writes about Dasein in the early sections of this chapter, the grounding. Dasein traditionally means something that is, so that you could speak of the Dasein of a bird or the Dasein of things. Dasein here is like the existence of my cup, the existence of my camera, the Dasein of the microphone, the Dasein of the guitar. Gives you a sense of what's around me. Well, the word means something else for Dasein, for Heidegger, as he writes on 234. And it's not necessarily so easy to understand. And Heidegger himself admits that Dasein, quote, taken in the sense of the other beginning, is altogether strange to us. So he's taken a word, a German word, Dasein, that had a customary, familiar, everyday sense, like we might say again, the existence of a bird, tree, or a coffee cup. And he uses it in a different sense, in the sense of the other beginning, and taken in that sense, it's altogether strange to us. You have to think, or you can try to think, Dasein as, to give you this phrase, the localization of the temporalization of being, or as the site of the moment of the event of the truth of being, or as the open space or the there that is appropriated by being. All of these formulations bring together Dasein as open space, as the site or the localization of the temporalization, in relation to being understood not as an eternal and constant presence, therefore not metaphysically, but rather, as we've discussed, as the clearing, concealing, which essentially occurs as the event. You bring those together, the being as event, Dasein as openness, open space, and you get formalizations like Dasein as the localization of the temporalization of being, as the site of the moment of the event of the truth of being, or as the open space or the there that is appropriated by being. It is furthermore not the case that every human being is essentially Dasein, or at least we can say that Heidegger wavers on this point at times. He writes on page 237, for instance, that, quote, Dasein is not simply the human mode of being. And I think we can understand that by saying that we have to include the idea of another beginning, or of inceptual thinking, or of overcoming metaphysics, or of grounding the truth of being in order to get to Dasein proper. So therefore, Dasein is not simply the human mode of being. And that Dasein is the ground of a determinate future being of the human being, not the ground of the human being as such. When we become Dasein by grounding the truth of being, therefore we're also grounding a determinate future being of the human being, and not the human being as such. Okay, so you have to take that into consideration, these kinds of formulations. Rather, it is the case that the human being can be essentially transformed in the leap as the one who grounds the truth of being, and therefore opens up and grounds the place called Dasein. There's a good formulation of that, in my view, on page 237. Dasein, the mode of being that is distinctive of humans in their possibility. In which possibility? In the highest one of humans, namely the possibility of grounding and preserving truth itself. That is what Heidegger writes. The last thing I want to point out in this connection is something I emphasized earlier in the course. Heidegger continues to insist that we won't understand him if we don't put ourselves into this movement of transposition. Here's what he writes, pages 237, 238. Everything said in this regard about the relationship between Dasein and the human being is vulnerable and liable to be misinterpreted if it does not enjoy the favor of those who participate in the questioning, who carry it out to some essential extent, and only from there understand what is said while letting go of their preconceived notions. So as I note here, that is the number one methodological imperative. Participating in the questioning, carrying it out, letting go of preconceived notions. You're not going to get access to what it is that Heidegger is trying to offer if you read it through a pre-established lens that he himself is calling into question. You could do that. You could find something valuable in doing that, but you won't get access to what Heidegger's offering. Now, I'd like you to look at the image on page 246. And I'm going to pause here and see whether I can pull that up for you on screen. All right, here we go. I've just added it to the notes. This is the image on page 246. Human being, gods, world, earth, E, and some arrows. We're going to discuss that. You can think of that as a sort of inceptual structure. The E in the middle is the event. Because the event needs to be grounded in Dasein, and because Heidegger often calls Dasein the in-between, as he does, for instance, on the very next page, I think it's helpful and accurate also to place Dasein in the middle. So we have then Dasein and the event in the middle. It's a little tricky if you start to try to interpret the direction of the arrows and some other things like that. But basically, Dasein stands in and as the opening of the event, where it can ground the strife, as Heidegger also calls it throughout the work, of world and earth. As the self-opening center, the event or Dasein also grounds the time-space for a relation of gods to humans. Again, I don't want to suggest that all of that should be immediately comprehensible, but Heidegger doesn't always give us structural depictions to work with. And in this case, the image on 246 can at least give us a way to think about Dasein as the in-between. It gives us a way to think about the notion of strife and the distinction between humans and Dasein and the relation of humans to gods. Let me just go off the notes, pull it up, and comment again as clearly as I can. So if you take this E bracketed space to be the ground and openness of Dasein, then one of the things you'll see is that there's a distinction between the human being and Dasein, right? Just like there's a distinction between the human being and the E. They're not the same. They're not in the same place. So that gives us an initial distinction between the human being and Dasein. Dasein comes to be in the grounding of the truth of being as the event. And it can have an interaction with the human being. It can maybe appropriate the human being over to itself. It can affect an essential transformation of the human being, but they're not the same at first here, structurally, systematically. Secondly, human beings and gods have some standing in relationship to the event of the truth of being, into Dasein. Could we say somehow that there's the intermediary space for the relationship between human beings and gods in Dasein and in relationship to the event? Okay, there's a lot that's built into this model that goes beyond what we can talk about here, but let me just say one more thing. Heidegger has works on what is a thing. And when we think about what a thing is metaphysically, we have one answer for what it is, one set of answers for what it is. But what about when we try to say what a thing is inceptually? What are beings in light of the event of the truth of being? What are beings interpreted in column B, as we laid out earlier? Well, one way to think about that is that what world is and what earth is undergo a transformation in moving to conceptual thinking. And world and earth and their strife are somehow embodied in or as beings when we think about them conceptually. Let me try to say that another way. You might, in the past, have thought about something in terms of form and matter, a form impressed upon matter. So there's a certain understanding of what the matter of the thing is, a certain understanding about what the form of the thing is, and you can bring together the form and matter and give an account of what the thing is. Well, for Heidegger, these elements of the explanation are not form and matter, which for him are still overly metaphysical notions. I'm just trying to convey this so that you have something to work with. This is not an exhaustive account. But instead, he works in these other terms, which he relates to this other phenomenon, the event. And therefore, we have a different vocabulary, and not just a different vocabulary, but a different vocabulary that stems from a different relationship to being, that stems from and is grounded in being differently. All right, so this is a little bit of what we get to work with using that model. If you find it helpful, you should think about it further. And if you don't, then maybe you omit it. I don't know. But if we go further in the notes, I want to point out to you that when Alexander Dugin, Russian political philosopher with several books on Heidegger, and there are courses on Dugin in the school, as you know, when Alexander Dugin wrote his first Heidegger book, he made a lot of use of this figure under the name of the fourfold, the fourfold meaning: world, earth, gods, and human. That is a notion from Heidegger, the fourfold, the name, das Geviert, the fourfold of world, earth, gods, and human. Dugin experimented with that model in different ways in rearranging the fourfold. So for instance, here we have an alignment of the axes that is vertical and horizontal. I'll just show you that. You see? It's vertical and horizontal. On the vertical axis, world and earth. On the horizontal axis, human being and gods. Straightforward. But you could tilt that model so that it's more like an X. And Dugin's idea in doing that was the sense that the conflict among the four elements changes according to how we depict them. Heidegger talked about the strife between world and earth, but not about strife between humans and gods. Well, you can rearrange the model so that you have strife between humans and gods, as well as strife between world and earth, or only strife between worlds and gods, and a horizontal playing field, as it were, between world and earth. So that's one thing. And another thing that Dugin cleverly did was map the being historical phases of metaphysics onto that model to show you how the underlying conceptual structure has been modified from phase to phase. And when I led this course as a seminar, I emailed the figures from his book so that people can have a look at them. And I think it would be appropriate to put them on screen here for your benefit. All right, let's have a look here. We're not going to go through this exhaustively, but I just wanted to give you a sense of it. So I have here 4 images taken from Dugin's first Heidegger book. And let's see whether this is clear to you. So here's the cross. Okay, so you see gods over on the upper right-hand corner, man over on the bottom left-hand corner, world or sky over on the top left corner. And if you're wondering why world or sky, Dugin discusses in his book why Heidegger uses sometimes the one and sometimes the other word. But in any event, world at the top left, and at the bottom right, earth. Dugin has shifted the model here so that it's in X form. And in the middle, you have the event, Aragnes. And here you have a transformation. So what is going on in this transformation? Well, upper left, sky becomes a place for the flutter of ideas. So you see here we're talking about what happens in the first beginning, the beginning of the first beginning in Plato. The ideas cloud sign being, S-E-Y-N. That's how I translated it when I was translating for my own use. Dugin's first Heidegger book. The ideas cloud, B-E-Y-N-G, and the sky is closed by ideas. You remember, what we have is no longer the openness, the clearing, definitely not the clearing concealing. Instead, we have the most beingful beings that stand in that space, and therefore the sky, the openness, is closed by what stands in it. That's the first transformation. Bottom right, meantime, earth is thought of as material, hule, as matter, and it loses the measure of the abyss. So we no longer have the clearing concealing. We no longer have the abyss. Instead, we have the ideas and matter. Later, like I said, form and matter. It's a way of thinking about it. In the upper right-hand corner, the living gods move away and run away. They flee because of what's going on in all of these other areas. And in the bottom left, man imposes himself and transforms beings into representations, into that which he sets before himself. They no longer show themselves in themselves as what they are, with their splendor, but they become objects for representing. And in the middle, being, B-E-Y-N-G, is replaced by essence, being as beingness. The thing becomes a symbol. It's decomposed into form and matter. The event does not occur. B-E-Y-N-G no longer shows itself by opening up. It doesn't happen. The event does not happen. So that's a transformation. I'll give you another one. Again, why I'm showing you this, we're talking about using the way that Dugin used this model in order to show the transformations in the conceptual structure that happened over the history of philosophy. I'll give you another one. So here's another transformation. In this transformation, you see you have God, the human being, and matter. There's no event here. Instead, what you have is God as object whose conceptual status is a function of the thinking of the subject. And likewise, you have sky and earth both become just res extensa, tells you we're talking about Descartes here. It both becomes material. So again, there's a sense of the material that gets transformed here. And the key thing is that here you have both the material and the divine considered as a function of subjectivity. Okay, I'm saving my favorite for last. So look at this one. Here you have both sky and earth and man as a created being, vis-a-vis or standing against uncreated, transcendental being. And the event is the event of incarnation and resurrection for the for the Christian tradition. So a different way of configuring the fourfold, different way of configuring world, earth, God, and man, or gods and man, as well as Dasein and the event. And now my favorite model from his book. Here we go. This is the postmodern situation. So you have a kind of fourfold in which sky or world is replaced by virtual reality, the screen, connectedness, a simulacra, the artificial sun, the son of night, the grinning nothingness. Man becomes the last man, the postman, the devil wears Prada. Earth is the cemetery of toxic waste. And God is the clown killer from Mars. Okay? This is a transformation of the fourfold, a very grotesque, sad, comical in its own way, and nevertheless tragic transformation of the fourfold in post-modernity. The topography he writes here, as you see at the bottom, is so ghastly that it can be called post-eschatological. It's life after the end of everything. Okay, the devil wears Prada. God is the clown killer from Mars. So the reason I showed you all of that again is because Heidegger's model, conceptual model of the event, the grounding, if he's right, we could say, should have distorted and transfigured versions over the first history of philosophy up until the present. All right, back to the notes. Hopefully you didn't find that to be too much of a meandering aside. You'll notice in the grounding some nice passages about the people. Remember, the people, meditation on the people constitutes an essential passageway, as Heidegger wrote earlier. So you'll see some nice passages about the people, and we must think about the people on the basis of Dasein and not vice versa. If we start from the I, then both the individual I and the communal people are metaphysical approaches. So in other words, starting from self-conscious self-certainty or self-certain self-consciousness, starting from that understanding, then whether you have an individualism or whether you have a communitarianism, whether you're dealing with one person or whether you're dealing with nations, peoples, and multitudes, there's a shared underlying metaphysics. But starting from Dasein and the selfhood of Dasein, we may be able to arrive at a genuine understanding of the I, the you, the thou, and the we, as Heidegger writes on page 252, 254. For instance, writing at the bottom of page 253, quote, selfhood, meaning here the being a self of Dasein. So it's not the same as being a subject or being an I for him. Selfhood is more originary than any I or thou or we. These are, as such, first gathered into the self and thereby become each respective self. So here's the simplest possible way of schematizing this. You have Dasein. Let me just see whether we can make this helpful for you. Imagine you have Dasein and Dasein's being a self as the basis for here being an I, being an individual, being a you, being a thou, being a community, being a group, being a multitude. Those are all forms of expression, as it were, of the underlying Dasein. If we are grounding Dasein. However, there's an alienated metaphysical self-interpretation, not grounded in Dasein, that sees the basis as the individual. And on that basis, you also have individual, other, and multitude, except it's not grounded properly. It's alienated. So the real alternative, like you might say, the alternative is whether you're individualist or a communitarian, whether you're all about, the individual or the group. And what Heidegger is saying, as we've seen throughout the course, is that there's a more fundamental distinction. Are we talking about the individual in the group metaphysically, or are we talking about the individual in the group conceptually? That's the real dividing line. Because on the basis of metaphysics, whether you're individualist or groupist is not decisive, which is why, one reason why you might say that Heidegger wrote World War II decided nothing. It's not that it decided nothing in every sense of the word. It decided nothing because the conflict was still taking place in one of the columns and not between the columns, as it were. Okay, so just trying to give you a handle. Let's go back to the notes. There are subtle and not so subtle philosophical criticisms of Nazi metaphysics in these sections. Because for Heidegger, in asserting the people or the folk, the Nazis were not just opposing liberalism, they were enshrining it even further as the self-conscious self-certainty of, in this case, the people. They were not actually moving into anything conceptual. So not so subtle philosophical criticisms of Nazi metaphysics in these sections. In another context, you may want to know, Leo Strauss once said about Carl Schmitt, another important, influential thinker affiliated with the Nazis, like a Nazi thinker, you could say. Strauss once said about Carl Schmitt that his anti-liberalism, in the concept of the political, never transcended the horizons of liberalism. You can find that in the book Concept of the Political. Notes to the Concept of the Political that Strauss wrote are published together with Schmitt's book. And Schmitt said that Strauss saw through him like an X-ray. Okay, let me just explain what I'm talking about here so you don't get lost. Carl Schmitt wrote a book called Concept of the Political, which was a fierce polemic against liberalism. Strauss read Schmitt's book, produced notes on it that Schmitt asked to have included together with the book, or in some way agreed with Strauss to have them published together, acknowledging the profundity of Strauss's comments. And in those comments, Strauss said that Schmitt, despite his criticism of liberalism, was still ensnared by the fundamental outlook of liberalism. We won't get into details of why, but I'm pointing that out as a parallel here to Heidegger, who's saying about Nazis that even though they may consider themselves anti-liberal, when it comes to the metaphysics, they share the same fundamental presuppositions. That's roughly what I'm trying to convey here. So as I write in the notes, Heidegger is suggesting in so many words that Nazi anti-liberalism also never transcends the horizons of liberalism, understood metaphysically, because it's just another form of self-conscious self-certainty. Only in this case, the community takes the place of the individual, yet the underlying issue remains. On page 255, you see another proof text, quote, "If instituted on their own initiative, no we and ye and no I and thou, and likewise no community can ever reach the self," showing you that for Heidegger, this notion of the self is distinct from all of this, because it's the word that corresponds to column B, to Dasein, to conceptual thinking, to the event. "Unless they are first grounded on Dasein, they, we, ye, I, thou, community, merely miss the self and remain excluded from it. They're still uprooted, alienated, inauthentic, and all of that. And that includes all Nazi talk of the community. And not only Nazi talk of the community, all talk of the community that's not sufficiently inceptual. In this chapter, The Grounding, Heidegger talks about truth in some ways that we had started to discuss before. Okay, so we're transitioning now to this new topic, truth. You have truth as the clearing concealing. That's the fundamental sense of truth as aletheia. Then you have truth as a correct statement. On page 261, Heidegger talks about the critical regress from correctness to openness, a very handy phrase. The critical regress from correctness to openness. I've mentioned this image before in other contexts, but here let me say it again briefly. Imagine two arrows, and you'll see this image in the course on Being in Time. Here we'll just mention it, or maybe I will pull it up for you. Yeah, let me just pull it up one moment. All right, here we go. I've added it to the text as you see. So first, have a look at it, and then I'll read to you what it is that we're looking at. So you see this top circle, that represents Dasein as an open space. The rectangle within that circle represents the beings that we encounter, inner worldly beings. Like my favorite examples, cup of coffee, pen, and all of that. Those are the beings that we encounter in the open space that we are, which is that circle. The line underneath the circle is showing you the root or basis or ground of Dasein. And what's beneath that line shows you what we're rooted in, what we're grounded in. Now, I'm just going to, on the spot, interpret this image for you, and then I'm going to go to the notes and read it. So there's going to be some repetition, but it's going to be a good way for you to have this clear. The uppermost arrow on the left here is truth as true assertion about a being. It's me saying something about that rectangle, me saying something about some inner worldly being. That my cup of coffee is full and no longer hot. Now, what's a critical regress? Well, the critical regress begins as we go to the arrow that's pointing down on the upper right. Okay, so now we're going from beings, from assertions about beings, from truth as a true assertion about a being, back to Dasein. We're now turning our speaking, our interpreting, our attention, our intentionality to Dasein, to our existence, to our existentials, to the structure that constitutes us as the being that we are. And then we make a further movement. From Dasein, continuing the downward arrows, from Dasein, we are now going to the ground of Dasein, to the fundamental truth, to aletheia, to that which lies at our basis, as it were, to that within which we stand, to the event of appropriation, to B-E-Y-N-G. So we have this movement. Normally, we're the uppermost arrow on the left, directed towards inner-worldly beings, our dealings with things. That's the normal mode. That's everydayness. That's fallenness. That's entanglement, to use some of the language from Being in Time. That's just what it is for us most of the time. If you remember in an earlier talk, I left it there for you to care for, and we said, on one hand, you had caring for the house, and on the other hand, you had caring for the things inside the house. That's kind of like this here. The things inside the house, that's by default in a way, and that's all the little rectangles, all the little objects, items, things, and affairs. Well, a critical regress is moving from beings to Dasein, from Dasein to fundamental truth, and having reached, as it were, truth as fundamental ground, you have that moment where the event, the essential occurrence, can ground itself in Dasein and ground Dasein in itself. What a beautiful image. Not giving myself any credit. It's Heidegger's image that we've just translated into something worth looking at. Okay, that was an exposition. Now I'm going to go through the textual exposition. So imagine two arrows pointing up, one on top of another, the two arrows next to that pointing down. As we saw, the first upward pointing arrow is the event of the truth of being, which opens the space for Dasein. The second upward pointing arrow is Dasein's speaking truly or correctly. In this case, because we're talking about truth, we're distinguishing truth as fundamental ground and truth as true statements. So in this case, Dasein speaking truly or correctly about beings it encounters. The critical regress is the two arrows pointing down. We want to turn our attention from beings spoken about correctly to Dasein and to truth as the fundamental ground of our existence. Heidegger sometimes distinguishes these two notions of truth by talking about truth, that's the ground of our existence, and what is true, That's the true statements about being. So you'll see that formulation in the English sometimes, distinguishing truth and what is true. For instance, on 262 at the bottom, he says the following quote, "Truth is the great disdainer of all that is, quote unquote, true, for the latter immediately forgets truth." Now, what he means there is that truth as correct assertions or statements about things in the world is associated with a forgetting of truth as the fundamental clearing concealing. All right, that's the, if you're wondering, what can he possibly be talking about when he distinguishes truth and the true? Now you know. He juxtaposes truth and what is true as well in section 220 on page 273. And in my view, if someone hasn't studied the book like we're studying it, with an attempt to be thorough and accurate, then those passages would be completely incomprehensible. It would sound like Heidegger is just not saying anything. But hopefully you've started to get a handle on what he does mean, and the arrows can help you think about the idea of a critical regress to openness, as well as about two senses of truth. And if we needed to, we can have here just, truth as true assertion about a being. If you want, you think about it as like truth subscript 1, whereas truth as the fundamental ground or precondition or original openness, clearing, concealing, you think of truth as subscript 2. Whatever helps in keeping them distinct, as well as in seeing their relation. Critical regress, there you go. What Heidegger is saying is not at all obscurantist or illogical or incomprehensible. It's quite clear, just it's not obvious to us because of what we are looking at most of the time. Another important passage that throws some light on what we talked about previously is section 209 on page 263. You can have a look, section 209 on page 263. The basic idea there is that when truth as unconcealment was interpreted as light, the concealment part was left out of the picture. It's a nice passage to bookmark since this is such a crucial theme for Heidegger. The following sections elaborate that basic idea nicely and show the stages in the transformation of truth as aletheia or unconcealment throughout the history of being. And you can look at the bottom of page 264, for instance. Aletheia as light. Now, why light? You might think, like, you walk into a dark room, nothing's visible. You turn on the lights, there's visibility. You can see the things that are in the room. And in seeing the things that are in the room, that's like your intellect being related to intelligibles. And we begin to focus on the connection between the intellect and the intelligibles rather than on the light that made that possible. That's one potential issue that arises, and there are others that arise when we think about truth with the metaphor or image of light. Aletheia as light becomes the yoke that yokes the intellectual perception with the intelligible perceived. This is in Plato's Republic cave allegory, for example. Sight is related to the visible, like intellect is related to the intelligible, and they're both brought together and made possible by light, which yokes is the medium for intellectual perception, just like it's the medium for visual perception. And this yoke becomes later homoiosis or adequation, sorry about the pronunciation, or adequation, which is transformed later into rectitude or correctness, certainty, validity, effectivity. So for Heidegger, this basic idea that visibility makes possible perception, like intellectual perception, the link, the yoke, the connection gets interpreted as first being adequation, that the perception is adequate to the perceived, that it sort of corresponds to it, that it matches it, that it's correct, that it's certain, that it's valid, and then later, as you see in his set of transformations, that it's effective. These are all different interpretations for Heidegger, transformations and ultimately distortions, mapping onto the eras or epochs in the first history of philosophy and concerned primarily with a fundamental transformation in the nature of truth as a function of its original interpretation in terms of light. In this sequence of sections, I want to highlight also 214 on page 268 for the following reason. So there too, Heidegger says that, quote, the guiding notion of light was not able to capture the open realm and its openness and elevate them to the level of knowledge. So this guiding notion left something out of sight, left something in the dark, and it never allowed that which was in the dark, we can't say to come to light, but never allowed it to become captured or elevated to the level of knowledge. The problem is not that any allegorical language will fail miserably, which you might think that, well, any image or any symbol of truth would have failed. Heidegger says that sensuous languages and images are helpful. They can be helpful because there's something that we understand at the outset. And this character of being something understood can give us access to the deeper dimensions of conceptual thinking. I've tried to use that throughout our time together, as you know, by bringing out useful images as often as I could, both the ones that we have in Heidegger and the ones that we can use to understand him, like the tides receding, the house, and all of that. Heidegger uses images not so often to be truthful, but in this section, he offers us the allegory of the jug, which you can consider in relation to the inceptual cross or fourfold that we discussed earlier. The goal in doing so is to connect the middle of that inceptual figure, the in-between, Dasein, the event, with what Heidegger says about the inner recess of a jug. So let's go back here. I hopefully find my place easily enough. Here you see we had human being, gods, world, and earth, and we had the E in the middle. Have the arrows in the parentheses. Well, not parentheses, but okay. You know what I mean. The open space delineated. And now we want to use this image that we have reviewed to make a little bit of sense of what Heidegger says when he gives us the image of the jug. So let me read that to you. The open realm, he writes, which conceals itself at the same time that beings come to stand in it, in each case is, in fact, something like an inner recess, for example, that of a jug. Yet it must be recognized that the inner recess is not just a haphazard emptiness, which arises purely on account of the surrounding walls and which happens not to be full of things. It's just the opposite. The inner recess is what determines, shapes, and bears the walling action of the walls and of their surfaces. The walls and surfaces are merely what is radiated out by that original open realm, which allows its openness to come into play by summoning up round about itself and toward itself such and such walls, the particular form of the vessel. That is how the essential occurrence of the open realm radiates back from and in the embracing walls. 268. So to just say that in a way that's easily comprehensible, the between is not a function of what surrounds it. Rather, the between, as it were, gives rise to what surrounds it. You have the middle pushing out the walls. Say it again from his quote. The inner recess is what determines, shapes, and bears the walling action of the walls and of their surfaces. Now, that's him talking about the jug, that it's not just an empty center, that the jug is a function of its inner recess. And again, I wanted just to bring that into connection with with this model so that you can see the importance here of what's in the middle, not just as a function of what surrounds it, but somehow vice versa. It's the action of the middle that configures the rest. Okay, take it for what it's worth. Hopefully it's a helpful connection. Let's go back to the notes. I'm going to transition to the future ones and the last God shortly, because after all, those are two sections that we still need to cover. Let me make one more comment about the section on the grounding. Remember, this is an introduction, so we can't cover everything, but I do want to identify some important sections for you. At the bottom of page 271, Heidegger writes the following. Where truth is veiled in the form of reason and the rational, its distortion is at work. That destructive force of the valid for all of universal validity, whereby everyone is arbitrarily placed in the right and the pleasure arises that no one may exceed anyone else with respect to something essential. It's sort of leveling universal validity. And the magic of this magic of universal validity is what has secured the predominance of the interpretation of truth as correctness and has made it nearly unshakable. That is evident, Heidegger continues, finally in the fact that even where something of the historical essence of truth has supposedly been grasped, All that has resulted is a superficial historicism, which maintains that truth is not valid eternally, but only quote unquote for a time. This opinion, that truth is not valid eternally, but only for a time, however, is merely quantitative restriction of the universal validity, and in order to become such needs to presuppose that truth is correctness and validity. Okay, 271, 272. Now, the point that I want to bring out to you from that is the following. Heidegger acknowledges a vulgar or superficial historicism, which says that truth is relative to its time. But this historicism is superficial because it doesn't know what it means when it says truth, to say nothing of time. It's still just limiting temporally a taken for granted notion of truth as correctness and validity that Heidegger is at pains to have us overcome. Heidegger tells us that if you encounter the position that truth is relative to its time, you must inquire as to the understanding of truth and time that is implied in that perspective. What makes this kind of historicism superficial is, as I said, that it treats truth as correctness and is derivative via restriction of the view that truth is universal validity. Truth as universal validity and the restricted view that truth is valid only for a time both miss truth as unconcealment. Superficial historicism thus misses the mark on truth, time, and history. And it does so on the basis of the veiling of truth in the genuine sense as reason. It veils truth in the genuine sense as reason. For Heidegger, truth in the genuine sense is neither rational nor irrational. It's related to thinking, but thinking for him is distinct from its interpretation as ratiocination or as reason. It's not easy, but it's very important because you might, again, encounter the apparent opposition between universalism and relativism. Heidegger says that's a false opposition because it's based on a shared premise that itself is problematic, to put it mildly. Let's turn now to discuss the future ones and the last God. The chapters on the future one and the last God are admittedly difficult. They are obscure to me as well in many ways, but I'll share with you some of what I've understood about them. Most simply, the future ones are those few and rare thinkers who have a presentiment about the meaning of our time, that it is a transition past metaphysics into another beginning. When you read this section, you should also consult page 76, which Heidegger refers to on the first page of the chapter on the future ones. And that's where we discussed, if you remember, inceptual gathering and compared it to the social contract theories. In that section, Heidegger distinguishes ranks of future ones in a numbered list. You have the few single ones who ground in advance the sites and moments for the realms of beings through poetry, thinking, deed, and sacrifice. You next have the numerous affiliated ones, as he puts it, to whom it is given to surmise and make visible the laws of the recreation of beings, as well as the laws of the preservation of the earth and of the projection of the world and the strife between earth and world. If the first ones ground the open space in advance, this second rank is given to surmise and make visible, as he puts it. That's vague, but it's what we have to work with. So again, it's kind of like the first few ones are the ones who hold the space of column B. They ground the possibility of another beginning, of a new history of philosophy and the essential transformation of mankind. And in holding that space, it's kind of like they're holding up the tent and then some people come under the tent and begin to do something. That's the second rank of future ones, the ones who come under the tent and begin to build, let's say. And the third rank is the many who are referred to one another according to their common historical, earthly, worldly origin, through whom and for whom the recreation of beings and thereby the grounding of the truth of the event acquire constancy. And it's kind of like they're the ones who, once the tent has been pitched and the people are building under it, come and participate in the life that's been built. They're all future ones, but they're future ones with different functions. It may be helpful to think of that in the following way. Heidegger has spoken throughout the text of the people, and he does so again in the chapter on the future ones, which is doubly significant because of how short that chapter is. You see page 316. If a people is authentically, then it is this many that share an inceptual historical origin and give it constancy. Let me just explain what I mean there. We said the philosophers, as it were, the poets, these rarest of the future ones of the great and grounding deeds, pitch the tent. And then you have the numerous affiliated ones. Then you have the many who go and occupy that space and live there. And it's the people who go and occupy that space and live there. It's a space for a people. People not here as multitude of individuals. People in whatever Heidegger's specific sense of it is that we have to try to piece together in our study of the text. So if a people is or exists authentically, then it is the people that is that many that shares an inceptual historical origin and gives it constancy. Okay, like I said, it's not easy, but it's not impossible either. The many among the people are not the rarest of the future ones. Okay, the many are not the rarest. And yet they exist authentically, genuinely, are grounded in. They are through what the few and the rare have opened up as possible and grounded through their surmising and making visible. So these are the three main classes: the single ones, the few, and the many. These three classes are classes of the distinctive future ones, quote, those strangers alike in heart, as Heidegger calls them. Why are we saying all of this? You have to try to understand. We're discussing the future ones in relationship to the grounding that follows upon the leap that we can only perform through the interplay and all of that. We have all of these pieces of the text having come together. And the grounding has its classes: the single ones, the few, the many. And who grounds and who gets grounded and who the players are is what we're trying to think about. And somehow the people, folk, narod for Dugin in the Russian version, is a key part of this account. Let's read the passage about the future ones and the people. Quote, "A people is a people only if it receives its history as allotted to it through finding its God, the God that compels this people beyond itself and thus places the people back amid beings." How is a people supposed to find the God, however, unless there are seekers who in reticence, remember reticence from the prospect way back when, who in reticence seek on behalf of this people, and who, as these seekers, must apparently even stand against the people that is not yet properly a people. Don't give up on this. The people cannot be a people yet if the seeker among them has not found their God. So a people is not just something given. It's not just something there. It's not naturalistic. It's not like the pen lying on my table. A people becomes a people when there's someone among them who stands against them as a seeker, against them in the sense of against the notion that they already are, and who really brings them to be in going against them in seeking. Properly, you'll forgive this formulation, christens the people, makes the people a people in his seeking. Okay? The seekers themselves must first be. Heidegger continues. Dasein, what else is it but the grounding of the being of these beings, the future ones of the last God? Now that is something comprehensible. Dasein as the grounding of the being of the seekers, the future ones of the last God, who in seeking and belonging to what they belong to, also ground the possibility of a people being a people. Now, I think it's fair to ask, what, if anything, is the relationship between the God of the people who is found by the seeker among the people who must, in seeking the God, stand against the people? Okay. The God of the people, because let me just tell you again here. We go up to the phrase here, how is a people supposed to find the God? Which God? Its God. A people is a people only if it receives its history as allotted to it through finding its God. Now we want to know, what's the relationship between this, its God, the God of the people, the God that compels this people beyond itself, and the last God of the future ones mentioned in the last phrase of that quotation. We have the future ones of the last God, and we have the God that compels the people. And we want to know, what is the relationship between those? Is the God of every people the last God? Is the last God distinct from the gods of peoples? As I write in the notes, we can't really answer that here. All we have are questions, and I'm going to try to show you that now. What are the questions that we can raise about all of this? The problem arises immediately that in inceptual thinking, we do not count the gods. As Heidegger writes on 231, quote, Dasein does not count the gods, does not count on them, and certainly does not reckon with an individual God, unquote. That means, among other things, that the last God is not last in a sequence which can be counted. Heidegger is quite explicit about that. What is last, he writes, is withdrawn from all calculation. Because the last God is withdrawn from calculation, we cannot even say whether the last God is one or many. No numeration here. Quote, the last God has his own most uniqueness and stands outside of the calculative determination expressed in the labels monotheism, pantheism, and atheism. Is Heidegger a monotheist, pantheist, atheist? Is he a polytheist? All of those questions assume that we can apply number to this realm. And Heidegger is saying you can't. So let's look at that passage starting on the top of page 326. There has been monotheism and every sort of theism, I believe this should say, only since the emergence of Judeo-Christian apologetics, whose thinking presupposes metaphysics. With the death of God, all theisms wither away. The multiplicity of gods, our crucial point, is not subject to enumeration, but instead to the inner richness of the grounds and abysses in the sight of the moment for the lighting up and concealment of the last God. Unquote. So that's mysterious, I think it's fair to say, but the point for our purposes is not to rush to judgment about whether Heidegger thinks there's one or many gods, and what the relationship is between oneness and manyness as concerns the God or gods. You know, that's our natural inclination. Are they the same God? Is there one? Are there more than one? There are many peoples, so therefore there are many gods, if each God has a people. And, you know, the last God means he's come last in a sequence. Heidegger is quite clear. What's last is withdrawn from all calculation, and Dasein does not count the gods, does not count on them, does not reckon with an individual God. We are not accustomed, I think it's fair to say, to thinking about the question of God or the gods inceptually. Inceptual thought is strange enough. This dimension of inceptual thought may be especially strange. We're now taking all of the strangeness to us of inceptual thinking and bringing it to bear on all of the strangeness associated with thinking about God, gods, divine, divinity, and that whole realm. And so, you know, on one hand, it should be no surprise if this is not immediately obvious. On page 327, Heidegger writes about, quote, the battle over the last God, i.e. over the grounding of the truth of Beyng. And he adds in parentheses that we are not capable of battling over the God himself. Now, I offer the following comment. That means, in effect, if you read it again and think about it, that the issue of the God, since we are not capable of battling over the God himself, the issue of the God is reduced, as it were, to the less obviously quote-unquote theological issue of grounding the truth of being. Why? Let me read it again. Because Heidegger said the battle over the last God, i.e. over the grounding of the truth of being. So he's telling us here that the battle over the last God is the battle over the grounding of the truth of being. And therefore we are, in very rough formulation here, allowing ourselves to move out of the theological question to the philosophical question. Now, that's misleading because these things are implicated in inceptual thought in important ways. And yet, Nevertheless, the issue of the God is reduced, as it were, to the less obviously quote-unquote theological issue of grounding the truth of being. It would seem that Heidegger could simply have continued to speak about grounding the truth of being, though, without discussing the last God. Since we can't battle over the last God, and God is somehow secondary to this issue of grounding the truth of being. So here's the question. Heidegger has just said the battle over the last God is a battle over the grounding of the truth of being, and we're not capable of battling over the God himself, so why even mention the God at all? What was the point of doing that? Heidegger says that it's not for the sake of a table of commandments, which we can interpret to mean that it's not primarily for the sake of morality or the regulation of actions. And therefore, his invocation of the God falls outside of the mode of political theology, as Leo Strauss, for example, discusses it when he contrasts philosophy to revelation and links revelation with a concern for morality. Not only, but importantly. The God for Heidegger is not invoked as a mechanism for justifying a public morality or divine law. Somehow the God belongs to the inceptual framework, only we don't fully understand why or how. So he could not just have left the God out and only spoken about the truth of being. And in bringing the God in, he doesn't have a political motivation. It's not political theology. It's not for a quote-unquote table of commandments. So we don't really understand why the gods belong to the inceptual framework or how, but neither, as it seems, does Heidegger, who raises these questions on page 400. Quote, in what does the divinity of the gods consist? Why being? Because of the gods? Why gods? Because of being? You see, he has questions, not answers. But he does have an intimation, the intimation of the last God beyond calculation, beyond metaphysics, beyond all forms of theism. This is a question for us to think. It's an invitation for us to think more. I can't offer any answers here, unfortunately, only point out the questions that Heidegger himself raises and the questions that we are forced to raise. And, maybe one of the most interesting among them is what it means to think the divine, to think about the divine, to think in relation to God or the gods, if we're outside of calculative determination. Now, I want to bring in two more texts for your consideration here. Sorry about moving the screen around like that. One from the contributions and one from a book translated in English under the title Mindfulness. All right, so passages from both contributions and from this other text called Mindfulness that are relevant to us now. So have a look at page 345 of the contributions. Heidegger says that there are 4 ways to make the thinking of the historicality of being question-worthy. Okay, so 4 ways to make the thinking of the historicality of being question-worthy. First, on the basis of the human being. Secondly, on the basis of the history of metaphysics. Thirdly, as a thinking of being itself. And fourthly, on the basis of the gods. And for the present remarks, we're just going to focus on the 4th way, making the thinking of the historicality of being question-worthy on the basis of the gods. Reading from that text, so again, contributions 345, or thereabouts, where Heidegger is discussing these 4 ways, quote, to grasp the thinking of being on the basis of the gods will immediately seem arbitrary and fantastic, insofar as, on the one hand, it means in general to proceed without hesitation from the divine, as if that were given and everyone agreed about it. And insofar as, on the other hand, it means still more outlandishly to proceed from the gods, as if a polytheism were postulated as the point of departure for philosophy. To speak of the gods does not, of course, mean that a decision has been made here affirming the existence of many gods instead of one. Rather, it is meant to indicate the undecidability of the being of the gods, whether one or many. This undecidability carries within it the question of whether something like being can be attributed to the gods at all without destroying everything divine. These are really striking and moving passages and really incredible thoughts. To speak of the gods is to name the undecidability as to whether a god and which god could arise once again as an extreme plight for which essence of the human being in which way. What is at stake in the decision, thus, over another beginning, is whether there can be a God again for us, and if so, in which way and who must we then be? Restating the end of Heidegger's quote. On the same page, Heidegger again speaks as to why metaphysical considerations are not fitting for the God or gods. Quote, a metaphysical consideration must represent God as the highest being, as the first ground and cause of beings, as the unconditioned, the infinite, the absolute. All these determinations arise not from what is godly about God, but from the essence of beings as such, insofar as this essence, conceived purely and simply in itself as constant presence and objectivity, and as what is clearest in representational explanation, is attributed to God as object. You see, so there are interpretations of God that stem from interpretations of the essence of beings as such, and not from what is godly about God. Let's continue with this passage a bit more. The denial of being to the gods means at first only that being does not stand above the gods, and that they also do not stand above being. Yet the gods indeed need being, and in this declaration the essence of being is already thought. The gods do not need being as their proper domain, in which they themselves find a place to stand. The gods require being so that through being which does not belong to them, they might indeed belong to themselves. Being is that which is required by the gods, but being finds its truth only in the inventive thinking which is philosophy in the other beginning. Therefore, the gods need philosophy. There's so much about this that is absolutely jaw-dropping, if you don't mind my saying so. Being is that which is required by the gods, but being finds its truth only in the inventive thinking, which is philosophy in the other beginning. Therefore, the gods need philosophy. A big question you could have considered at some point in your studies of Nietzsche and Strauss, for example, and Plato, is whether or not the gods philosophize, whether the gods need philosophy, and if so, what that means. And here we have the gods needing philosophy. We have the gods not being thought of metaphysically. And I just want to say one more thing here about the gods not standing above being. Mark that so we don't lose it. Let's go back to this image. Here are the gods. And maybe one reason why Heidegger's configured the image in this way, you see the gods have a relationship to Dasein, to being, to the event, to the grounding of the truth of being, and nevertheless don't stand above or below, certainly neither above nor below the distorted version of this that takes being as beingness, or as that which is essential to all beings. Kind of like what we saw, different versions of what the God is here. So here you saw God does stand, as it were, above being. So a lot here to think about, a lot here that is pretty important. Where did we leave off? I think it was page 8, right? Sorry, here we go. So one more passage on the gods and the last god, this time from Heidegger's book called in English, Mindfulness. There's more there on the gods than in the contributions. Okay, in this work called Mindfulness, there's more on the gods than there is in the contributions, more in fact than we can discuss. But to bring out a point that connects with what we talked about last time, namely in the last summary video, the importance of Plato's interpretation of being as idea in the cave allegory, Heidegger writes, quote, in 2 millennia, no God appears any longer, perhaps because of the divine Plato's culpability. Being and its truth have been buried under propositional thinking and surrendered to idea through objectification. In other words, the realm of the gods has been buried by Platonic philosophy. Man's way of being has become unbearable to gods. Heidegger says something here that's a clue about how to hear the word gods. Again, He already told us, don't think about it polytheistically, right? So it's not obvious that we know how to hear the word gods. So let me read you what he says here. In being historical thinking, that's thinking that thinks in terms of the history of BYNG. The name gods merely attunes the empty sight, merely names the empty sight of the undeterminedness of godhood that arises out of man's lack of attunement. Let's read that again. In being historical thinking, the name gods merely names the empty sight of the undeterminedness of godhood that arises out of man's lack of attunement. Commenting then, gods names an empty sight. That's what he says. The name gods merely names this empty sight. The name, quote, does not rest on the certainty that there are beings and spirits that are extant somewhere and that work in many ways. Do you understand? Heidegger does not say gods and imagine that there are 26 spiritual beings flying around pulling on everybody's heartstrings. Or puppet strings. What then does Heidegger mean by naming an empty sight? Right? Because if God's names an empty sight, what in the world does that mean? Well, quote, to name an empty sight means here making room in thinking for a domain of question worthiness, a thinking that at the same time must be already attuned by an attunement that sets man free from every calculative bonding to being. Okay, so let's put all of this together. The gods, word gods, does not name the plurality of divine beings. It does not decide for one or many gods. It indicates rather undecidability and undeterminedness concerning godhood and stands in relation to inceptual thinking. Remember, to name an empty sight means making room in thinking for a domain of question worthiness. This then is not a political theology, a civil religion, or a metaphysical onto-theology. It may be that Heidegger is indicating the realm where philosophy and religion have not yet departed from one another, not because thinking is too primitive to have advanced toward its differentiation, but because it is so inceptual that it has not yet succumbed to the historical differentiation that arises from the abandonment by being. At least I hope that these passages begin to give you a sense of what Heidegger does not mean with the terms the gods and the last god. There are still more questions here than answers, to be sure, but that's precisely in keeping with the nature of Heidegger's project, which after all is driven by our questioning into what is most question worthy. All right, that takes us to the end of the notes. This was a summary review of those sections in Martin Heidegger's contributions to philosophy of the event called Grounding, the Future Ones, and the Last God. That takes us to the end, properly speaking, of our course on Heidegger's contributions to philosophy of the event. And I hope that you have had a memorable experience of this incredible work, once called Heidegger's second masterpiece. Thank you for your time and attention. See you in the next course.